Chapter 10. Encounters with the Formless. Here's a passage from the Samadhi Raja Sutra, a Buddhist text that's about 19 centuries old. Know all things to be like this: a mirage, a cloud castle, a dream, an apparition, without essence, but with qualities that can be seen. I first heard this at a meditation retreat where one of the teachers had been going on and on about the formless. If you got to a point in your meditative practice where you apprehended the formless, I gathered, you were perceiving reality more truly than if you were still hung up on the world of forms, tables, trucks, bowling balls. The formless isn't a particularly well-known bit of Buddhist terminology. But there's a better-known word that means roughly what this teacher meant by the term: emptiness. Whichever term you use, the upshot is that in the world out there, which seems so solid and so structured, so full of things with a distinct and tangible identity, there is less than meets the eye. This world of apparent forms is in some sense, as the Samadhi Raja Sutra has it, a mirage, a cloud castle, a dream, an apparition. Or, as the Heart Sutra famously and pithily puts it, form is emptiness. Apparently, some very accomplished meditators get to a point where they feel this truth deeply and may even see the world as empty or formless on a regular basis. This is considered an important feat, especially if your goal is to attain enlightenment. As you ponder these words, formlessness and emptiness, two other words may come to mind: crazy and depressing. It seems crazy to think that the world out there isn't real, that things that seem substantial are in some sense devoid of content. It also seems kind of depressing. I don't run into a lot of upbeat, fulfilled people who go around rejoicing in the emptiness of it all. But I've slowly come to think that actually this idea isn't so crazy, and that in fact it makes more and more sense as psychology advances. And as for the depressingness, thinking of the perceived world as in some sense empty doesn't have to strip your life of meaning. In fact, it can allow you to build a new framework of meaning that's more valid, maybe even more conducive to happiness than your old framework. I hasten to add, my willingness to defend formlessness and emptiness depends on what exactly they're taken to mean, and different Buddhist thinkers have meant different things. I'm not here to defend the most extreme version of mind-only Buddhism, with its claim that the world out there doesn't really ultimately exist. At the same time, I'm not just pulling a bait-and-switch. I'm not going to define formlessness and emptiness in some sense that's so narrow and technical that the validity I claim for the underlying idea turns out to be trivial. I think there's an important, if subtle, sense in which we attribute too much form and content to reality. And I think appreciating this can have, and should have, radical implications for our lives. But let me start at the non-radical end of the argument. There is a pretty uncontroversial sense in which when we apprehend the world out there, we're not really apprehending the world out there, but rather are constructing it. After all, we don't have much direct contact with the world. The things we see and smell and hear are some distance from our bodies, so all the brain can do is make inferences about them based on indirect evidence: molecules that waft across the street from a bakery, sound waves emanating from a jet plane, particles of light that bounce off trees. For example, the world is three-dimensional, but you see it via two-dimensional fields of data, the points of light impinging on the surfaces of your eyes. In order for our minds to see a three-dimensional world in all its depth, we have to take these two depthless data fields and use them to build a kind of theory about that world. And sometimes the theory is wrong. If you go to a 3D movie and put on your 3D glasses, your brain will be fooled into seeing superheroes leap off the movie screen toward your seat. Take off your glasses, and you'll see that, no, actually, it's just you and popcorn in your immediate vicinity. Or look at a more old-fashioned optical illusion, such as the famous Muller-Lyer illusion, which makes you think one line is longer than another, when in fact it's not. These illusions take advantage of assumptions our mind makes about how the two-dimensional patterns on our eyeballs will reflect a three-dimensional world. The people who create the illusions have contrived situations where the assumptions don't hold. Of course, in everyday life, the assumptions almost always do hold. Our minds are very good at what they do. By and large, the trees we see are trees, the jet planes we hear are jet planes, and so on. Still, the point is that strictly speaking, this is a matter of construction. Perception is an active, not a passive process, a process of constantly building models of the world. That's one reason different people see different things in the abstract ink blots used in Rorschach tests. Our minds try to turn even the most ambiguous patterns into something that makes sense. We like to have a story about what things are and what they mean. During meditation, our stories about things can fall away. For example, sometimes I meditate on sounds. I may do this rhythmically, focusing on my breath on the inhale and some sound in my environment on the exhale. Or I may go whole hog and just focus on the sounds, ignoring my breath entirely. In fact, sometimes at a meditation retreat, a teacher will devote a whole session to sound meditation. If you sink deeply enough into this practice, the structure you impose on sounds can start to dissolve. For example, an airplane may fly overhead, and you hear an airplane flying overhead sound, except you don't necessarily think, oh, an airplane. You're so immersed in the texture of the sound that you may not immediately think, oh, an anything. It's just pure sound, unattached to the idea of a particular concrete object. I guess it's what an airplane would sound like to somebody from a culture that didn't have airplanes, or to an alien from a civilization so advanced that its aircraft didn't make noise. It would just be sound, not the sound of anything. A good question to ask me at this point would be, but what good does it do to forget that airplane noise is coming from an airplane? Glad you asked. The answer is, not much good at all. But now consider another example, a case where this sort of forgetting does do some good. Turning noise into music. Once I was at a meditation retreat and a new dormitory was being built, so there was the sound of hammers and buzz saws. Now, you might think that construction noise isn't conducive to quiet contemplation, or for that matter, to anything pleasant at all. I've never seen buzzsaw offered as a downloadable ringtone. And in fact, the meditation teacher who explained early on that we'd be hearing construction noises all week did so with an apologetic tone. But as the teacher reminded us, a big part of mindfulness meditation is to accept the reality you face. Normally, if you heard the abrasive, annoying sounds of construction, you might close your window or do something else to tune them out. But here, the idea was to accept the sounds themselves while not buying into the idea that they're abrasive and annoying. Doing this isn't easy, but it's straightforward in principle. The key is to meet the abrasiveness head-on, to, in a sense, examine the abrasions. You pay attention to the discomfort the noises create. Where in your body does annoyance or even revulsion reside? What is the texture of the feeling? The more fine-grained your examination, the more complete your acceptance of the feeling, the more its negative energy drains away. In fact, not only did I manage to let go of the idea that these sounds were unpleasant, as I immersed myself in the sound waves emanating from hammers and buzzsaws, the whole thing started sounding, pretty literally, like music. You may think of buzzsaw noise as abrupt and jarring, but I found a grace in the way the sound winds down with its descending tone, and in the way it resumes with a more rapid tonal ascent. The buzzsaw sound came to seem so beautiful that I found myself getting unsettled during long periods of silence, sitting there hoping that a construction worker would hurry the hell up and cut some plywood. Of course, this just shows how far from enlightenment I am. According to Buddhist doctrine, I shouldn't become attached to things I find pleasant. But the point is that I had taken what is commonly called noise and found music in it. It may be obvious where I'm headed. If we can turn literal noise into music, can't we turn figurative noise, all kinds of unwelcome perceptions and thoughts and feelings, into figurative music? Or at least take the harshness out of them? And it may be obvious how I'm going to answer that question. Yes, we can.
with sufficiently diligent practice. But before getting into these practical applications, let's get back to the original question. What exactly did my little buzzsaw symphony have to do with the formless, with emptiness? Well, for one thing, at this retreat, I think I had managed to let go of what you might call the buzzsaw form. The sound of a buzzsaw is part of a whole structure of connotations, central among them, of course, the idea of a buzzsaw. And I think one reason we find buzzsaw sounds grating is because they're part of that structure, that is, because we know they're coming from buzzsaws. Buzzsaws, with their well-known capacity to sever bones as well as wood, are things many of us don't welcome contact with. Maybe the connotations of buzzsaws and the negative feelings those connotations evoke help give us an aversion to the sound. Of course, it may also be that humans by nature tend not to like the kind of sound a buzzsaw makes. Certainly, we're born with tendencies to like or dislike certain kinds of things, certain tastes, smells, sights, sounds. Still, there's no doubt that our reactions to perceptions are also to some extent a product of experience. At one point in my meditation, the buzzsaw sound, having escaped its usual buzzsaw form, started occupying another form. It started reminding me of a dentist's drill. And immediately, of course, it became really unpleasant. It was only when extracted from both of these forms, buzzsaw form and dentist drill form, that the sound was pleasant. Remember Ajahn Chah, the Thai monk who said that if you try to understand the idea of not-self by intellectualizing alone, your head will explode? He once recounted a time when he was trying to meditate and kept getting interrupted by sounds from a festival in a nearby village. Then, as he recalls it, he had a realization. The sound is just the sound. It's me who is going out to annoy it. If I leave the sound alone, it won't annoy me. If I don't go out and bother the sound, it's not going to bother me. I wouldn't take that anecdote too literally. It's not as if sound bothers you in retaliation for your bothering it. The point is just that a sound by itself is a passive, not an active thing, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So to make it unpleasant, you have to go out and, in a sense, do something to it. Look again at the final line of that passage from the Samadhi Raja Sutra. It says that all things are without essence, but with qualities that can be seen. This sutra isn't denying the reality of the buzzsaw sound waves that were hitting my ear, the qualities I was observing, but it seems to be saying that the essence I normally see beneath the qualities, essence of buzzsaw, is a matter of interpretation. It's something I'm choosing to construct or not from the qualities. Essences don't exist independent of human perception. This is the version of the emptiness doctrine that makes sense to me, and it's the version most widely accepted by Buddhist scholars. Not the absence of everything, but the absence of essence. To perceive emptiness is to perceive raw sensory data without doing what we're naturally inclined to do. Build a theory about what is at the heart of the data, and then encapsulate that theory in a sense of essence. An obvious rejoinder arises, but isn't there in fact something at the heart of the buzzsaw sound? You know, something called a buzzsaw? Something that's not empty and does in fact have form? It's wonderful that you were able to put that fact out of mind and thus turn noise into music. But if the buzzsaw is really there, then your picture of reality wasn't getting clearer, but actually was in some sense getting less clear, right? And isn't the idea of Buddhism that you reduce your suffering by seeing the world more clearly? The next few paragraphs do not contain a wholly satisfactory answer to these questions. Ideas as radical as emptiness can't be persuasively defended with one cute little buzzsaw anecdote. But I hope that within a couple of chapters, this idea will sound, if not undeniably valid, at least much less crazy than it may have sounded at first. Meanwhile, let me just give a preliminary response to these questions about the alleged emptiness and formlessness of a buzzsaw. Yes, the buzzsaw exists. It consists of things like a power cord, a blade, and a trigger. These, you might say, are among the buzzsaw's qualities. But when I talk about the essence of the buzzsaw, I'm talking about something we perceive in a buzzsaw that is more than the sum of such qualities. Something that carries distinctive connotations and emotional resonance. And if I manage to divorce myself from some of those connotations and that resonance, enough that I can actually enjoy the sounds of a buzzsaw, then that essence has started to erode. To put it another way, before this particular meditation retreat, I might have said it is part of the essence of buzzsaws that they make unpleasant sounds. But it turns out that making unpleasant sounds isn't actually inherent in buzzsaws. And if it isn't inherent in them, how can it be part of their essence?
In the next chapter, I'll argue that the essence of lots of things, like maybe all of them, is not in fact inherent in them. For evidence, I'll draw on diverse findings from modern psychology. After that chapter, I hope that this idea of formlessness or emptiness will seem more plausible, or, at the very least, that you'll have a clearer idea of exactly the sense in which I'm claiming it's plausible. Meanwhile, one more retreat anecdote. It's stories all the way down. On the retreat at which I first heard about the Formless, each yogi got one 10-minute meeting with one of the teachers, one-on-one, where we could raise any issues we were struggling with and get the teacher's guidance. My meeting was with a teacher named Narayan Liebenson. She is the one who read that passage from the Samadhi Raja Sutra, but it was the retreat's other teacher, Rodney Smith, who had talked about the Formless. This was my chance to get Narayan's take on exactly what he meant. Narayan, by the way, is hardcore. Like most teachers at the Insight Meditation Society, she has done intensive contemplative practice, including months of solitude in the forests of Southeast Asia. She doesn't teach meditation just to reduce stress, though she is, of course, happy for that to be one of the benefits. She's here to help people achieve liberation. For that reason, she didn't wholly approve of my writing this book. After all, writing a book about Buddhist meditative practice could impede the practice itself. If you're trying to achieve certain meditative states so you can describe them in a book, you may be less likely to achieve them, and less likely to make various breakthroughs that can come from approaching the practice in a different spirit. She once said to me with a solemn look, "I think you may have to choose between writing this book and liberation." But, I pointed out, the book might help other people follow the Dharma, and if it helped enough of them, wouldn't that make up for my own failure to achieve liberation? She was unmoved. Her job is to teach liberation, and at that moment she was my teacher. Besides, she seemed to think that nothing does more good for the world than a truly liberated being, not even an unliberated author who steers others in the general direction of liberation. Anyway, in this particular conversation, I asked Narayan whether Rodney's perspective is widely shared among the Vipassana teachers. Did she take the idea of the Formless seriously? Yes, she said, she did. And no, the things Rodney had said about the Formless weren't considered radical in her circles. Joseph would talk that way too, she said, referring to Joseph Goldstein. So I pressed her on what precisely was meant by the term. She confirmed my suspicion that it didn't mean that the physical world doesn't exist or that it's devoid of structure. Tables exist, buzzsaws exist. After a few minutes of conversation, I felt I got her gist. I asked, "So the idea is that everything meaningful about the world is something we impose on it?" She answered, "Exactly." I hasten to add that this doesn't mean we live in a meaningless universe. Deeply embedded in Buddhist thought is the intrinsic moral value of sentient life, not just the value of human beings, but the value of all organisms that have subjective experience, and so are capable of pain and pleasure, of suffering and not suffering. And this value, in turn, imparts value to other things, such as helping people, being kind to dogs, and so on. Moral meaning is, in that sense, inherent in life. But the point Narayan was making is that as we go about our day-to-day lives, we impart a kind of narrative meaning to things. Ultimately, these narratives assume large form. We decide that something we've done is a huge mistake, and if we had done something else instead, everything would be wonderful. Or we decide that we must have some particular possession or achievement, and if we don't get it, everything will be horrible. Underlying these narratives, at their foundation, are elementary narrative judgments about the goodness or badness of things in themselves. So, for example, if I start spinning a long narrative about how coming to this meditation retreat was a huge mistake, and I'm always making mistakes like this, and so on, there are a number of questionable premises on which this story rests. There's the premise that, had I not gone on this retreat, whatever I did instead would have gone swimmingly, whereas for all I know, I would have been run over by a bus. There's the premise that having a few painful experiences this week means the retreat was on balance bad for me, whereas in fact, its long-term effects are unknowable. And at the base of this narrative lie the most basic kinds of premises. Simple perceptual judgments, such as, this buzzsaw sound I hear while trying to meditate is bad. And this kind of meaning, which seems so firmly embedded in the texture of things, isn't, in fact, an inherent feature of reality. It is something we impose on reality, a story we tell about reality. We build stories on stories on stories, and the problem with the stories begins at their foundation. Mindfulness meditation is, among other things, a tool for examining our stories carefully, from the ground up, so that we can, if we choose, separate truth from fabrication,